Let's be honest, owning a home has always been at the heart of the American dream. For generations, it's been a symbol of stability, success, and a place to call your own. It's where families grow, memories are made, and futures are built. But today, that dream is slipping further and further out of reach for millions of Americans. In 2026, the hope of homeownership is fading, and one of the biggest culprits is something most people rarely think about: the soaring price of wood. Lumber, once a humble building block, has become a luxury item, and it's sending shockwaves through the entire housing market. Lumber is the backbone of American home building. Every wall, every floor, every roof, almost every part of a new house starts with stacks of 2x4s and sheets of plywood. But now, those basic materials have become so expensive that they're triggering a full-blown housing crisis, the likes of which we haven't seen in decades. The result? New homes aren't just more expensive, they're often not getting built at all. Construction sites sit abandoned, projects are put on indefinite hold, and would-be homeowners are left waiting, wondering if they'll ever get the keys to their own place. Imagine trying to bake a cake when the price of flour triples overnight. That's exactly what builders are facing with lumber. The cost of materials has skyrocketed, and it's throwing the entire process into chaos. Contractors' budgets are exploding, timelines are being torn up and rewritten, and buyers are left reeling from sticker shock. The price tag on a new home can change by tens of thousands of dollars in just a few weeks, making it nearly impossible for families to plan or save. This isn't just a temporary blip or a short-term hiccup. It's a grinding, relentless crisis that's been building for years. The housing market is stuck in a slow-motion disaster, and there's no easy fix in sight. For young families, the goalposts for homeownership keep moving further away. They save, they plan, they dream, only to find that the price of a starter home has jumped again, or that the house they wanted is now out of reach. Builders, instead of ramping up to meet the huge demand for new homes, are paralyzed by uncertainty and spiraling costs. Many are forced to walk away from projects, lay off workers, or close their doors entirely. The engine of American housing is sputtering, not because there aren't enough buyers, but because the basic materials needed to build are now out of reach for everyone from small contractors to major developers. Across the country, half-finished developments with their wooden frames exposed now dot the landscape. These skeletons of homes stand as stark reminders of a market in gridlock, where dreams are put on hold, and communities are left unfinished. So what's behind this mess? The root cause is lumber prices, driven sky-high by a crisis that, as we'll see, was entirely self-inflicted. From supply chain breakdowns to policy missteps, the story of how we got here is as frustrating as it is avoidable. The American dream, once built on a foundation of sticks and boards, is now hostage to the price of a 2x4. And until we solve this crisis, the hope of homeownership will remain just that, a hope, not a reality, for millions of Americans. To understand this mess, rewind to the Trump administration. That's when the US slapped heavy tariffs on Canadian lumber, aiming to protect American mills and jobs. The idea, make Canadian wood pricier so builders would buy American. But the US construction industry had relied on Canadian lumber for decades. The assumption that US mills could instantly fill the gap was wildly optimistic. Expanding milling capacity takes years, not months. Instead of a targeted fix, the tariffs were a sledgehammer, jolting the entire system. The result, a self-imposed wall that trapped American builders and buyers in a supply crisis. The US housing market was built on Canadian lumber, literally. Before tariffs, nearly a third of all softwood framing came from Canada. This wasn't a weakness but a smart, efficient partnership. Canadian wood was abundant, high quality, and affordable, essential for keeping US homes within reach. The supply chain was seamless, with Canadian logs feeding American construction from coast to coast. Tariffs didn't just raise prices, they severed a vital artery. The US couldn't simply replace billions of board feet overnight. Cutting off Canadian supply left the American housing market exposed and vulnerable. When the tariffs landed, it was as if a shockwave rippled through the entire economy. The market didn't just react, it convulsed. On Wall Street, traders scrambled to make sense of the chaos, while on Main Street, ordinary people felt a creeping sense of dread. News headlines screamed about trade wars and looming crises, but for many, the true impact was still a mystery. Almost overnight, the price of lumber shot up. Hardware stores and suppliers, fearing even higher costs, began to stockpile whatever they could get their hands on. Forklifts buzzed through warehouses, moving precious inventory, while builders rushed to secure materials before prices climbed further. The entire supply chain was suddenly in a frenzy, each link in the chain desperate to avoid being left empty-handed. As word spread, panic buying set in. Shelves that once overflowed with lumber were picked clean. Price tags seemed to change by the hour, and customers stared in disbelief as costs soared. The fear of running out only made things worse, fueling a cycle where prices spiraled ever higher and supplies vanished even faster. For builders, the situation was dire. Many were locked into contracts, signed months before, with no way to pass on the sudden spike in costs. Construction sites ground to a halt as budgets were blown apart. Contractors pored over paperwork, trying to find a way out, while clients demanded answers and solutions that simply didn't exist. Small contractors already operating on razor-thin margins faced impossible choices. Some had to sit down with homeowners and deliver devastating news. Projects would now cost thousands more or worse, be canceled altogether. Dreams of new kitchens, additions, or even basic repairs were put on indefinite hold, leaving both builders and clients frustrated and anxious. The shock didn't stop with the professionals. Everyday DIYers, weekend warriors, and first-time home improvers were stunned at the register. Projects that once seemed affordable now came with jaw-dropping price tags. For many, the simple act of buying a few boards for a backyard project became a financial gut punch. A single sheet of plywood, once a humble staple of any renovation, suddenly felt like a luxury item. Empty racks and sky-high prices forced people to reconsider their plans, or abandon them entirely. The trade dispute, once just a distant headline, was now hitting home in a very real way. Families sat around kitchen tables, tallying up new bills, and wondering how they'd afford repairs or renovations. News stories about tariffs and trade wars were no longer just background noise. They were shaping daily life and straining household budgets. For some, the dream of homeownership or even finishing a simple project was slipping away. Couples put off buying homes, and half-finished projects gathered dust in garages, abandoned as costs soared out of reach. The crisis was no longer just about numbers on a screen or headlines in the news. It was personal, reshaping lives and dreams in every neighborhood across the country. Canada didn't wait for the US to change course. Instead, it pivoted, fast, finding new buyers for its lumber in Europe and Asia. The Canadian government boosted domestic demand and helped mills forge global partnerships. Lumber that once flowed south now shipped overseas. Even if US tariffs vanished, Canadian wood wouldn't flood back. New markets were too valuable. The supply chain was permanently altered. America's most reliable supplier had learned to live without its biggest customer. When the US imposed tariffs on Canadian lumber, many believed American mills would simply step up and fill the gap, but the reality was far more complicated. Despite the optimism, American mills just couldn't keep up with the sudden surge in demand. America is home to vast forests, stretching for miles across the country, but having trees is only part of the equation. The real challenge was that there simply weren't enough sawmills equipped or ready to ramp up production quickly. Many regions had the raw material, but lacked the infrastructure to process it at scale. Building new mills or expanding existing ones isn't something that happens overnight. It takes years of planning, permitting, and construction, not to mention massive financial investment. Even if a company wanted to expand, the risk was enormous. Mill owners hesitated. What if the tariffs were reversed in a year or two? They worried about pouring millions into upgrades, only to see demand vanish if trade policies changed again. The uncertainty made them cautious, and many chose to wait rather than gamble. The result was a persistent supply bottleneck. Lumber piled up in some places, while builders in others faced long delays and shortages. The system just couldn't adapt fast enough to the new reality. US mills did increase their output, working overtime and pushing their equipment to the limit. But compared to the scale of the Canadian supply chain, it was a drop in the bucket, barely making a dent in the overall shortage. Other foreign sources of lumber were available, but they were pricier and much harder to access. Shipping costs, import restrictions, and logistical hurdles made it nearly impossible to replace Canadian lumber with alternatives. The Canadian supply chain was uniquely efficient, with high-volume mills and streamlined logistics. For decades, it had supplied the US with affordable lumber at a scale American mills simply couldn't match. The end result? The US had created a hole in its own supply chain that it couldn't fill. Lumber prices soared, home builders faced delays, and the cost of new homes climbed higher than ever. The policy meant to help American mills only expose their limits, revealing just how dependent the U.S. had become on its northern neighbor for affordable, reliable lumber. The supply crunch hit homebuyers hard. Lumber price spikes added tens of thousands to the cost of a new house. For many families, that meant homeownership was out of reach. Builders, squeezed by costs, slowed or canceled projects. Housing starts dropped, and delays stretched for months. The housing shortage grew worse, not better. The policy meant to help Americans made homes less affordable. The numbers told the story: high prices, low confidence, and a market in turmoil. In the end, the lumber tariffs backfired. The U.S. didn't revive its mills or protect workers. It made homes more expensive and scarce. The policy was a direct tax on anyone hoping to build or buy. The lesson: global supply chains can't be rebuilt with a single policy. Cut off a third of your supply, and prices will skyrocket. The lumber crisis of 2026 wasn't a natural disaster. It was a policy choice. In trying to build a wall, America trapped its own homebuyers inside.